And amen. Well, you guys can go ahead and have a seat. And thank you, Joe and Cheryl. Amazing worship this morning. Let's give it up for those guys. They probably didn't realize that was like one of my all-time favorite worship songs. I don't know if I've ever said, Joe, you can just move my stuff there if you need to. I don't know if I've ever really mentioned it, but I tell you what, it is absolutely one of my favorite worship songs. Sometimes I come in here during the week to work on things, and I put that song on and I hit the repeat button, and it'll go for what feels like an hour, 40 minutes. But it just goes, and I blast it loud because I love that worship song, just how much he really loves us. So let's just get a couple things out of the way really quick as we move into the message. I don't want to take a lot of time, but if you are one of our kids and next gens, you can head out there with Miss Wendy and Pastor Beth Ann. They are ready to go. They've been looking forward to having you guys today and being a part of what you're doing. Know and understand that there is something that I will give out some more details next week. March 27th is actually a camp day. So if you have kids or next gen guys that are 6th grade to 12th grade, I had to make sure I had that right. They are going to open up the camp for one day just to do some cool stuff to get some guys understanding and knowing and acknowledging what they do at camp during the summertime season. And so you'll be able to just sign up your kids, let us know. Again, it's one of those things that we support and we back our summer camps like crazy. So there is a very, very small fee with that, but the church will cover that fee for the parents and for the families because we believe in the next generation that much. So just know that is coming up. Next announcement is March 14th at 6 p.m. If you follow us on Facebook or know, I put it out, I'm going to say Friday night. It could have been yesterday. I lose track of my days, but I think it was Friday. I put out the event that we are going to have a night of worship right here at the church. March 14th is actually a Sunday, and it's going to be at 6 p.m. I was very intentional with picking that day because first it's the daylight savings time. So we actually spring forward an hour during that time period, which leaves it a little bit lighter. I know that there's some of us that just don't like to drive in the dark, and so we're going to expand that so that it'll be daylight while we're here and daylight when you go home, so that you have the opportunity to come and just dwell in his presence for like an hour of just worship. Like if you think 15, 20 minutes is good, you should experience it for an hour. And so we are going to open up the house and we're going to just have a night of worship. No message, no nothing, no talking. I think I might just get a welcome in, but I'll try to stop right there. And just, man, we just want to come and be in his presence and just experience worship with him. If you've never experienced it, I encourage you to experience his presence like that. And then the last thing is next week starts our new series. I thought I was going to squeeze it this week, but God took it a different direction today. And so we're going to follow where he's going. But next week, since we have this night of worship coming into it, I thought what a more appropriate time for us to just come into a series called Made to Worship. Made to worship. You know, there's a lot about our society and a lot about our culture that we lose sight of what real true worship really is and what it's all about. And we lose this relationship with God sometimes because we change directions on who and what we should be worshiping. And so I'm just going to leave that little piece right out there. That's my little cliffhanger because I could preach it today and I would be totally cool. But we are not going to go down that road today. But just know that starts, and we're going to take that probably right through Easter. It's a pretty lengthy one because we are going to break it down, biblically break it down, Old Testament. If you never thought that you would hear me preach from Leviticus, I'm going to be in Leviticus and Numbers and the books that are not my most favorite in the world to read. So, but when God takes you there, I'm understanding when you go there and you see what worship really, truly is all about, and how God has laid these things out in our lives and laid it out scripturally on how to do it and how to put him first. It's pretty amazing. So just be prepared for that. All right, guys, so let's get into today's message. Let's just jump into where we're going. We're going to turn to Esther 3 today, and we're going to go verses 1 through 2. I figured we'd break out a little bit of Queen Esther. I mean, if you don't know a whole lot about Queen Esther, by the end of today, you're going to know some stuff about Esther and her life. And so let's just start right at Esther chapter 3, verse 1. You can follow us on the screen. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of that lady, because I can't say that word, the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by. For so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down and show him respect. And so we are going to stop right there, and we're going to take a journey in Esther's life. There's some things in our lives and our times when we move along. I don't know if you've ever experienced it, but maybe you have, and you can think about it. It's like sometimes when we begin to get elevated with God, when we start to grow in God, when we start to maybe move into a new job position, or maybe we're getting married, or maybe we just had our first kids. It's all these different facets of our life. But when we begin to get elevated and grow and move, it seems like the enemy is being elevated and growing at the same exponential, sometimes even faster, moving at a greater pace than we are. And it always puts this enemy in front of us, which you can never understand. Like, why would God begin to elevate us, but also elevate an enemy at the same time to distract us from what he's called us to do? If you've ever thought about it, when Wendy and I first got married, you think the first 6 months are, they're pretty good, but suddenly you get a little bit down in your marriage, and suddenly these things start to pop out, and these problems and these situations and going on, and you're like, oh, that's a pretty big problem. Maybe there's health issues that start to come forward, journeys of me and Wendy have been through with health issues and those kind of things, but they start popping up and these little distractions, and it seems like the enemy is just grabbing us from everything to stop us from getting to our fullest potential of what he's done. And see, Esther is experiencing that. See, if you don't know much about Esther, she was a young woman whose parents had died. She went to live with this guy Mordecai, which is a relative related to her. And so she went to be and live with him, and she started this process to grow. Now, she's as of Jewish culture and a Jewish background, and lived as an Israelite, should I say. But as she was growing, Mordecai came to her and said, hey, look, you need to keep who you are secret. You need to keep that quiet. And so don't tell anybody you're of Jewish culture. Just be you. Just be Esther. And as she was growing and as she was going on, King Xerxes had, I'm trying to think of the polite word to say, banished the queen that was there. I was upset with the queen who was before her. And so he began to look for a new queen. And he had called out all of the ladies, all the virgin ladies of the time, to come forward and be presented before him. And so Esther, being single, was one of those ladies that got called out to go in front of the king. But it wasn't an easy process. The process took a year of her going through oils and perfumes. Like, I just can't imagine what it would be like to be bathed and put into lotions and oils and perfumes for over a year of what they'd be like a cleansing process to make sure that they were perfect before they went in front of the king. And before they got in front of the king, they were growing and stretching, and I can imagine what it must have been like to do this process. See, Esther was being elevated by God to make it to this level of being favored by the king. But during the process of going through this leveling up, getting through to get to the king to be favored by him, she goes through the struggles of losing her family. She goes through the struggle of hiding who she is. She goes through the struggle of not being able to tell, but going into probably a room that had lots of ladies in it. It probably just wasn't her. It was many women. And I'm sure that in the midst of all of this, they're all comparing each other. Look at you. No, look at you. Look at you. Look at you. And they're all picking and piecing at each other because each one is trying to be the new queen and get in front of the king and be favored by him. And so there's probably some bickering going on in this year-long process of trying to get to the king, and she's trying to get to this elevation elevated part of who she is and where God's called her to go. And when she gets there, she confronts and she gets in front of the king with a very simple thing. And she walks in front of the king, says, that's her. I find favor with her. I like her. And so she becomes queen. But see, what we lose sight of is at the very same time, this guy named Haman is being elevated. And Haman is this guy who hates the Jewish culture. Matter of fact, he wants to annihilate and destroy the Israelites. He wants to wipe them out like a genocide, just get rid of them. So at the same moment that an Israelite woman, a Jewish woman, is being elevated, another man by the name of Haman is also being elevated on this side of the spectrum, being elevated to a position where he is almost pretty much greater than where Esther is at. See, Haman has said that he is really like second in command. So if you don't know much about the Persian Empire, it was this great, large empire. And it took over a lot of property. I can't remember the exact amount of land, but it took over a ton of land in the Middle East. And there were so many people that they had to break these things down into provinces. And when they broke them down into provinces, like states, then they broke them down and put these princes over these provinces. And these princes, which were 7 of these princes over these provinces, reported to Haman so that Haman would report to the king. So the only way that these guys ever got to the king was that they had to go through Haman. So everything that happened in the Persian Empire went through Haman to get to the king. He was elevated. But yet he hated the Jewish culture and was there to annihilate who they were. So the very same moment that Esther is being elevated, Haman is being elevated as well, at another higher level almost, which is really interesting when you think about it, because why would God allow something like that to happen? Why would he allow Haman to be elevated to a position knowing that they hated the Israelites, and then have Esther coming into the picture? Well, see, sometimes God puts these enemies in our lives, and they're bigger enemies than we could ever think or imagine, because it forces us to rely on Him. And sometimes He puts them in there to elevate us to the next level. Think about it like this. See, many times in my life, if I think back, or if you think back 10, 15, 20 years back, think about some of the problems you used to have 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And if I think back in my life and my marriage and our jobs and just all kinds of things, there were some times in my life when I saw these problems, these enemies coming in front of us, in front of Wendy and I, in our marriages and finances and all this, that we're like, how in the world are we ever going to get through this situation? And now when I look back at it, I'm like, I could go through that again and I could make it. Why? Because the size of the problem, the size of the enemy elevated me to the next level. See, if I just look at the problems, if I just look at the enemy back then, if I look back at the enemy now and look back and say 20 years ago there was this enemy, and it was this financial enemy, and he was coming after Wendy and I, and we didn't know how we could make it. We didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. I didn't even have 2 pennies to put together. We struggled from check to check. We didn't know what was going on in our life. And how are we ever going to give to God? How are we ever going to be faithful in our tithe? How are we ever going to be faithful in our walk when it just seemed like God wasn't really answering or moving along in our lives? But now if I look at it, I'm like, man, those enemies are not very big at all. They're kind of little enemies back then. See, the enemy has not changed his size. Get this. It's the same size. He is the same problem. The same enemy was 20 years ago. He is the very same size as he is today. The difference is that I've grown. And because I've grown, the enemy is a lot smaller. So the enemy doesn't change. He stays the same size. But because of that, God is elevating us to grow into something new. And because He's growing us into something new, there has to be something that drives us to perform. There has to be something that takes us to the next level. And what takes us to the next level is this enemy called Haman, who is driving Esther to the next level, to move up and where she's at, to be elevated. It's interesting that God could grow two things at the very same time and allow two things to grow at the very same time. See, we have to look at our enemies differently, because sometimes the enemies can be used to elevate us. If you look at it, David would have never become king if he would have never faced a giant, which was the enemy, a 10-foot giant. David was not that big, but that's what elevated him to the next level. Moses had to go and confront Pharaoh, the enemy, because it took them to the next level. It elevated them. So he had to go confront a larger enemy so that God could elevate him to the next level. And that's where we're at. That's where we're at as people, as Christians, as churches, is that we can't be scared of the enemy, no matter what the size of the enemy. Because God's already defeated the enemy. We just have to realize it and know it. See, that's the amazing part of the story, because Esther is scared of Haman. She does not want to go in front of the king, knowing that she could say something to the king about Haman and be killed. Because King Xerxes could just go find another queen if he really wanted to. It wouldn't be a long process. It wouldn't be very hard for him. And so she had to learn how to deal with a few things. And I want to take the next few moments to talk to you about how we can deal with this enemy. What do we do to handle the situation, to make it through it? What do we do to get to the next level? What can Esther teach us through the biblical scriptures, show us how to make it to the next level? See, the first thing we have to know is we have to confront the enemy. Confront the enemy. Okay, so here's Esther, thinking about it again. Here's Esther. She knows what the problem is. She sees the problem. She's not sure how to handle the problem, but she's told what she needs to do, and she has fear to go to the king to tell the king, because the law says that if she goes without being summoned by the king, then it's instant death for her. And so some point in her life, some moment, some second, she had to come to the realization to say enough is enough. I'm going to go confront the king, even though I know I can be put to death. And she goes and she confronts the king about Haman. She goes and she confronts him. Now, if you're thinking, well, Haman can't be too much of an enemy. Well, let's look at this guy by the name of Haman for a moment. Let's look at him and his story and who he is. Now, it says that he's a son of the woman that I cannot pronounce her name, but she is an Agite. If you don't know much about the Agites, let's do a little history for you. See, the Agites come from a clan that's called the Amalekites. And the Amalekites are one of the first enemies of Israel. So way back in the beginning of the Bible, way back in Genesis, Exodus, there's a story that comes along that says the Amalekites attacked Israel for no reason, slaughtering many of them when they were getting water and drinking. And God came to pass, and he said, I am going to deal with the Amalekites. In my time, I'm going to deal with the Amalekites for what they've done. So here's the Amalekites. They attack. They're an enemy. They're slaughtering. They're killing. And then as we start to move forward in the Old Testament, we start to see that this guy, King Saul, Saul is king. And this guy by the name of Samuel steps into the picture. And he's a prophet. And he comes to Saul, King Saul, and he says, it's time you deal with the Amalekites. God says it's time that you do it. So you need to go out there, and this is what you need to do. You need to slaughter and wipe out the Amalekites, everything. Don't take any of their treasures, none of their jewels, no women, no nothing. Kill all of them, get rid of them, annihilate them, wipe them out. Take the enemy out. And for some reason, King Saul decides not to wipe them out and not to get rid of the enemy. And he saves the king, King Agag. Now, here we go. Keep following me. So King Agag, an Amalekite, is still alive, and out of King Agag, because the problem wasn't handled when God told him to handle problem, has now grown back into another nation and is now more powerful than it was before. And then if that's not enough, later on, a little bit later, the Amalekites come and attack David, go to a city by Ziklag, take all of the women and children, while David is out fighting battles, comes in, takes all the women and children. King David, or not King David, but David comes back. He's weeping, he's sorrow, he's crying because the women and children, his wife, they have all been taken. All from the Amalekites that were not handled. And then you get to King Saul again, because it seems like this problem just keeps coming up, because then King Saul goes in and they're in battle and they're in war and they're fighting and he gets wounded. And 2 Samuel chapter 1 says that there was a moment when he was running from the Philistines and running from the attacks and the enemy, and he had been wounded. And so he had went up on a mountain, was running, and he knew he did not want to get captured, because if he was captured, he would be tortured and just all these things would start happening to him. And he was not going to go through that process. And so he says, no, I'm not going to do that. He went to the top of the mountain. He grabbed his spear. Some of the Bible's translations say spear, some say sword, and he pressed it against his chest. And when he pressed it against his chest, he didn't have enough strength to do it on his own. So he saw a guy walking along the roadside, and he said, hey, come and help me. And the guy's like, who are you? And he goes, I'm King Saul, but I can't be captured because of all these things that are going to happen to me. So can you help me kill myself so that I'm not captured and taken into captivity? The guy says, yes, I'll help you do it. And he goes, but wait, tell me, who are you first? Who are you? And the guy goes, I'm an Amalekite, and shoves him down on the sword and the spear and kills him. Still not dealt with what has been out there to be dealing with, to deal with. The Amalekites have not been confronted. And now we are some 400 or 500 years later, and Esther is sitting here dealing with the very problem that has been out there for however long, dealing with an Agagite again, and she comes to the point and she says, enough is enough. I've had enough of the enemy. We're going to go take care of this. See, sometimes in our lives, we have to understand that there comes points and times where we need to say, enough is enough from the enemy. Enough is enough. We need to go deal with this thing. Here's even a more messed up part about it. If you don't deal with it, your generation's going to deal with it. The next generation's going to deal with it. The next generation is, because it's a generational enemy. It's not just your problem. See, the thing is that many of us will blame our upbringing, our uprising. You know, this is how I was raised. This is how it went. Great. I get it. There are bad situations that kids and people are raised in. I know it. I've seen it. I know they're out there. But you have the ability to change it. You have the ability to change it. At one moment and one time in your life, enough is enough. Anger is enough. Addiction is enough. And if you don't deal with those problems to confront the enemy, to get through those things, it's going to continue on to the next generation and to the next generation and to the next generation. So at some point, you have to confront it and go after the enemy to stop him. It's biblical. The next thing we have to think about, don't change your tactic. Don't change the tactic. You know, it's funny to think, because new enemy, new thing, new time, new tactic, new way of doing something. We always think it's new. We got to go find something new. Look, it's the same enemy that's been there for time began. Okay? Enemy hasn't changed. We change. And we change because we think of new tactics, new ways of doing things, but we shouldn't change what really works. See, there's another little piece of the story of this that we need to think about. See, often we think about, when we think about King Saul and David and his upbringing and his defeating Goliath and going into battle with Goliath into the enemy's life, we all know that King Saul, they threw his armor on top of David. And we know the response is David's like, I can't battle in this. I can't fight in this. And we always say, well, you need to be your own person. That's how we look at it. Be your own person. Don't try to fight somebody else's battle. Don't wear somebody else's armor. But if you look at it through David's perspective, David says, look, I can't fight in your armor. It's there, but I'm not going to change the tactic. Because you know what saved me on the side of the field when I was watching over my father's sheep? The slingshot and the rock. That's what I had perfected. That's what God used me for. So why do I need to change the tactic of what I'm doing? I just need to go to the dry riverbed and grab a few more rocks and take them with me, and we'll handle the problem. I'm not scared of a 10-foot giant sitting on the other side of a field calling us out, because I have what God has given me, which is my tactic of the 5 rocks and a slingshot. He didn't change the tactic. See, for me, the tactic never changes because the Bible is the truth. I don't change that tactic. I don't change my worship because the worship is the tactic, worshiping Him. I don't change being generous in my life and giving to God and people and living a life of generosity, right? Because the tactic works. It's biblical. It's truth. I don't change the tactic. When the enemy comes, then I'm at church. When the enemy comes in my finances, I'm still living a life of generosity, even though it's a struggle. But I know the tactic works. If the enemy's on full attack, I know I'm in my Bible in the mornings. I know I'm in my worship as it's going. I know these things work because I've been through the process, and I know those tactics work because they're in the Bible and they're biblical truths. The tactic works. Don't try to change God's tactics. Don't try to change them. Look at it and say, man, I should be like David and say, no, this works. That's what I'm sticking with, and that's what will get me through it. Final thing, keep your focus. Keep your focus. You know, there's more about Esther's story than a lot of us really read or really think about or come to. And if we move later on in Esther's stories to the end, and she presents herself in front of the king says and asks her a very specific question. And the king says, what is it that you want, Esther? I'm willing to give you up to as much as half of my kingdom. What is it you're asking of me? Now, I don't know about you, but that up to half of my kingdom, and it's the Persian Empire, that is no small amount of what she could be given to rule over, and financials and monies and treasures and all of this. I mean, just crazy amounts of stuff. But God says, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. And Esther returns and says, well, there's just one really thing that I want. I want a banquet. I want a meal. And at that meal, I want to come and sit with you and have a banquet and a food with you and eat with you. Oh, but I want Haman to be there as well. Isn't that funny? Like, why would she ask for the enemy and the problem to come with her to a banquet at a table and a meal in front of the king? If the enemy is the problem, she could have very well went to the king without Haman and just left him off to the side. But there's such a lesson there about our focus. Because if you think about it, here's the table. The table, Haman is sitting across the table. King is sitting at the floor of the table. He's sitting at the head of the table. And never in the scripture does it reference her ever giving conversation to Haman. All her conversations were with the king. Everything was with the king. Haman was just kind of sitting there. Now, I don't think that Haman was probably sitting there quiet. I could be wrong. But if we think about it in today's culture and society, I'm very sure that somebody, your enemy, is sitting across the table is not going to be quiet when the process is going, because she's telling King Xerxes what he's trying to do. And he's probably over there saying, you Jewish culture, you whatever. I mean, just probably blabbing out these names about her. You know, you're worthless, you're useless, you can't do this, you're not in charge, you're below me, you're not above me. All of these things that were being reminded to her, and all she did was stay focused on the king. Stay focused on the king. See, isn't that kind of cool? Because in our lives, in our culture, in our worlds, we lose focus of the king because we're so focused on the problem. We're so focused on the enemy. Look what he's doing today. Who cares? Look what he's trying to do today. Well, who cares? Because see, if we don't lose sight of the focus of the king, then the problem is just kind of like, it's way out here in peripheral vision. It's just not real. It's there, but it's no big deal. Because the king has already defeated that. We just lose sight of it, and we go over here and look at the problem, and we're so navigated and focused on what the enemy is doing and all the attacks and everything that's going on that Jesus is out here, the king is out here, and we have just he's there. I know he's there, but it doesn't seem like he's doing it. Well, it's because you're focused in the wrong place. And she focuses on the king, leaving no conversation for Haman to come into place. And literally, within 24 hours of this banquet happening, the very destruction that Haman was doing, was putting together and manufacturing and putting out, was the very same death that he had. See, he put up a post in the city that he was going to put Mordecai on and impale him on, this large post for all the Jewish culture to see what was getting ready to get done to them. But Haman didn't realize he was building his own destruction. See, when you think about it, the enemy is already building his own destruction. What he's caused to come into your life to destroy you is actually what's going to be destroying himself. Because if we can keep our focus on Christ, if we can keep our focus on God, if we can keep our focus there, God will handle that. He's got that. Because the king says, is this how you're doing the culture? Is this what you're doing to her? And they threw a blanket on his head and took him out and impaled him on the pole for all to see. And Mordecai, here's the best part, Mordecai knew it was coming. He absolutely knew it was coming. The enemy knows it's coming. And as long as he can keep you focused off of it, then it gives him a little bit more leverage in your life. See, at the first banquet, there was actually 2 banquets, but the first time that they met, but Haman left and went back to his wife and was talking to her about how everything was falling apart, how everything was changing. Don't you want to feed some of that back to the enemy? I mean, isn't it time in our life where we just come and say, enemy, enough is enough. It's time for this confrontation. See, it's time for the battle, but I don't have to fight the battle because God fights my battle. So it's time for the battle. Just take it, you're going to lose. You're not going to win. And so we start to see this story starting to come together and develop. How do we confront an enemy that God allows to grow at the same pace or more than we are at the same very time? But yet we understand and know and begin to see that God is putting these things in our life not to hurt us, not to disappoint us, not to make us feel like we're not there. He's like, if you just don't lose focus of the king, all this other stuff you ain't got to worry about. That's your focus. Stay focused. Isn't it time for the church to have enough of that? Isn't it time for us as a Worcester Foursquare church to say, you know, people used to say we were shut down, we were never around, we haven't been around in 20 years. Isn't it time to say, you're just a small church, you can't have great impact inside of the city, inside of the community, inside of this county? Say what you want. God gives the gifts. Stay focused on who he is. It's why this impact that we go after, this Engage Our City, is so powerful. It's so impactful for us. It's because we don't lose sight of that focus of where God's called us to go, keeping our eye on him. How to do that? It's in our lives. Keep our focus on the life. Don't listen to people when they tell you you're no good, you're useless, you're worthless. If you're a young lady, you're not beautiful, you'll never have a husband. If you're a guy, you'll never have a wife. Don't listen to those things, because that's just the enemy trying to stop and destroy the goodness of what God has created, the perfection. If you're hooked into addictions and they're hard to get rid of. Addictions, I know it. But enough is enough with the addictions in life. It's time to start taking those steps and moving forward, growing in him and who he's called you to be. Such a great testimony of Esther's life. A young woman who hid herself, announces herself to the king, tells who she is. And a kingdom, a nation, a culture is saved by her. I mean, there's so many books written about Queen Esther and how powerful she was and the impact she made in our lives, that we can't lose sight of the journey, of the road that she traveled to get where she was at. All of the things that must have been said about her, told about her, all the memories that must have been popped into her head. You don't even have a mom and a dad. You were raised, pretty much you're adopted. You have no history, no culture, no family, no land, no property, no animals. You name it. She heard it. The difference is that she never let it conquer her. And that's where we have to be. The enemy's words have no power and no strength in your life as long as you remain focused on him. Let's bow our heads as we pray. Jesus, we just thank you for this word today. Lord, we just thank you for this opportunity that we get to hear a story of Esther and how she remained focused on you. And because of that focus on you, Lord, you used her. And Lord, I'm praying today that over our congregation, those online and here in the sanctuary, Lord, that you begin to open our eyes to what you've called each and every one of us to do. Lord, that you'll change and turn our focus from the things that the enemy is doing and around us in our lives to turning our focus back onto you. Lord, that we will begin to notice and see and confront the enemy, that he has no power here in our lives. And as we confront, Lord, that we just stay the course. Don't change the tactic. Don't change our worship. Don't change us being humble and a life of generosity. Don't change who you are. And then, Lord, keep our focus on you. In Jesus' name, amen. Look, guys, I hope you enjoy this one. Take this one to heart, because the enemy is coming from any and every direction possible to try to distract us from what we're called to do as a church and as individuals. Okay, big C, big church. Think about that this week. When you travel or walk around this week, think about it. Is this an enemy attack that he has no power in my life? And get your focus back on him. Turn the worship on somewhere, put earbuds in. Man, there's no place the devil can go when you got worship going on. And that's why it's coming into this next week and these next several weeks. Don't miss this next sermon series. Man, God is doing some really amazing things when we start to change our worship towards him. Man, there's nowhere the devil can go and hide inside of that. And so just remember that. Remember March 14th, is going to be our night of worship. We're just asking, hey, let's fill this place. And let's just come into his presence. And man, let him just work in us and through us. Right? All right, guys, I love you. We'll see you guys next week at 10 o'clock.